May 7th, 1747, Sebastian Bach, Frederick the Great of Prussia, a meeting which really represents the intersection of two very different worldviews, philosophical views toward religion, politics, certainly music, and the arts. Greetings, music lovers. Rick Ferguson, rickfergusonmusic.com. Thank you for joining me in this video. Please feel free to like this video. It helps ever so much. And subscribe to my YouTube channel if you don't already do so. So, May 7th, 1747, after having spent 2.5 days on a stagecoach, accompanied by his oldest son, Friedemann Bach, Sebastian Bach arrives in Potsdam, Germany, outside of Berlin, to the court of Frederick the Great, having essentially been summoned by Frederick. Of course, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, CPE Bach, one of Bach's other remaining sons, was court harpsichordist, composer, teacher of Frederick the Great, and a significant presence in that court for 30 years. We'll talk a little bit more about CPE in just one moment. Out of this meeting between Sebastian Bach and Frederick the Great came, of course, this wonderful set of pieces entitled The Musical Offering. And this set of works that Bach composed as a result of this meeting, and having been presented by Frederick with what came to be known as the royal theme, really is a culmination of the art of contrapuntal composition. Such a wonderful set of 10 canons of various types, a 4-movement trio sonata, and then 2 fugal works, a 3-voice fugue, and then a 6-voice ricercare, which musicologist, pianist, teacher, and thinker, deep thinker about music, Charles Rosen, has described as the most significant keyboard composition in the history of keyboard composition. So this series of works that came as a result of this meeting in 1747 literally put the cap on a number of things during this period from Sebastian Bach's point of view. One of several large works, for instance, Sebastian Bach was working on the art of fugue, still working on it at his passing. And then we have some other larger contrapuntal musings that Bach was working on at that time. The idea being that counterpoint from Bach's generation and before tended to be the most meaningful way to gain a sense of understanding of revealing the grand design of the universe, the inner workings of the universe. Canonic writing seemed to be the purest form of this pursuit towards revealing this grand universal design, going all the way back to the work of mathematician, musician Pythagoras in ancient Greek times. Mathematical ratios to describe what he called perfect sounds, the unison, the fourth, the fifth, the octave. And this was very much taken to heart by Bach and his generation as well, as opposed to the Enlightenment-inspired thinking and worldview that Frederick the Great certainly espoused. The idea being that if one can observe, the scientific method having been one part of this Enlightenment-inspired thinking, if one can observe the universe or anything within the universe long enough, meaningfully enough, one can come to understand the workings of the universe simply from meaningful observation. In musical terms, if music is overly complicated, it tends to alienate. Music should be more accessible immediately, both to the performer and the listener, so that that transmission of understanding, that transmission of feeling and expressiveness can be much more immediate. And so here we have two very different worldviews. From a societal standpoint during this time, it really is a point of departure between, up until this point, social conformity, really challenged by the oncoming assertion of the individual, and certainly the individual artist, the individual thinker, the individual philosopher, painter, musician, what have you. So a really heady time in music. So we have Bach representing in Frederick's mind that which is essentially an anachronism. And it seems that Frederick had a point to prove when he presented the royal theme. And let's hear this theme. Let's hear this royal theme. So that is the theme which was presented to Sebastian Bach on his arrival, and he was asked to improvise. Please improvise me a three-voice fugue, and so on. And Sebastian was happy to do so, but actually the important aspect of all of this is what came several weeks later after Bach's return home and him creating this incredible set of music, really encapsulating the highest form of Baroque counterpoint. Let's look at Frederick the Great, a very conflicted character, impactful, brilliant, artistic, obviously. His idea bringing Enlightenment ideals into rulership, really seeing himself as an enlightened despot. He often referred to himself as carrying the weight of responsibility as king on his shoulders, much as Atlas carried the weight of the world on his. Lack of reliance on ministers. He felt it was his duty, as did his father before him, essentially, but much more so with Frederick, to be the sole ruler and sole responsible party within the laws at that time. Made a number of reforms, agricultural reforms, industrial reforms, freedom of the press to a great degree, and then reforms in terms of social supports. So, he did really take a lot of these Enlightenment-inspired ideals seriously. He created the largest and most significant military in pre-Napoleonic Europe, and also expanded Prussia's territory at that time. So he was a very active ruler, having been so terribly treated by his father, Frederick William, as during his rule, and having brought a lot of that trauma and negative experience into his own rulership, really from 1740 until his death in 1786. I think it's also important to note that culture during this time in the Prussian court for Frederick the Great meant French culture specifically. Remember that Germany at this time was so divided into so many smaller kingdoms, duchies, what have you, and the sway of French philosophy, writers, politicians was tremendous at this stage. And Frederick, he did not speak German, he spoke French. He wrote in French. As a matter of fact, his book published in 1746, Histoire de mon temps, History of My Time, was one of the real influential writings during this time on the state of politics, the state of life in Europe during this particular time. So he was a deep philosophical thinker, constantly inviting French philosophers, writers, and other important French diplomats and thinkers to his court in Sanssouci outside of Berlin as guests to debate, to discuss. So there was a real built-in tension between Frederick the Great and his espousal of French-oriented thinking and culture, and then that which Sebastian Bach represented, which was Sebastian's generation really wanting to find and begin to create some kind of real Germanic musical identity right? And that being done primarily through contrapuntal composition. But there is a third individual, of course, in this scenario, which is C.P.E. Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel, who joined first Crown Prince Frederick's court in 1738, and then when Frederick became king in 1740 with Frederick and remained, as I said, for 30 years, CPE had to wait for 17 years before getting his first raise in wages, and he remained faithful in many ways to the vision of Frederick, but then also sought out a lot of his own opportunities, of course. There is a really fascinating article that composer and musical philosopher Arnold Schoenberg wrote in 1950, really espousing the idea that it was not Frederick the Great that composed this royal theme. It was indeed C.P.E. Bach, whether at the behest of Frederick or on his own, to essentially set a trap for his father during his visit, because this is such an unwieldy thematic motive to work with from a contrapuntal standpoint. Schoenberg was convinced that this was a trap set for Sebastian by CPE, who apparently had some issues, mostly philosophical, with his father. Some real significant tension, both loving his father and respecting his father's work, but then also not so much at times. And so I think CPE was conflicted between his feelings for his father, but also his strong feelings about Enlightenment-inspired thinking, especially where music is concerned. So CPE ended up composing 5 flute sonatas for Frederick, and also, I think, of more significance, 6 string symphonies with significant winds parts that Frederick could play himself as a part of this. Frederick, on the other hand, composed 121 flute sonatas and 4 flute concerti, and we have 4 books of flute solfeggi exercises. Of course, now the composer and flutist Johann Quantz was at the court of Frederick, so there's a lot of speculation as to how much assistance Quantz provided in terms of filling out a lot of these compositions, but nonetheless, it really goes to show Frederick's dedication, his devotion towards his own flute playing, his own music making, but also Enlightenment-inspired composition of the time, the galant style. CPE, as a composer, of course, was writing in this style, but especially with his keyboard writing, came to be known as really the founder of the empfindsamer Stil, a sensitive or expressive style of playing. So let's hear some musical excerpts. Let's hear a short 3-movement flute sonata, first by Frederick the Great. This is sonata in E minor, grave, first movement, Allegro assai, the second, and then a Presto for the third movement. I'm joined by my friends and colleagues, Caroline Pittman, flute, Veronica Kolegas, cello. So this is sonata in E minor for flute and continuo by Frederick the Great. Enjoy. Now, let's hear a couple of two short movements from a piano sonata of C.P.E. Bach that I feel really illustrate this Empfindsamer Stil that C.P.E. was cultivating as a composer and beginning to take advantage of the more expressive qualities of the early piano, the forte piano at that time. So we have the second and third movements of a piano sonata in G minor by C.P.E. Bach. Second movement is Andante. The third movement actually is a Cantabile, of course, in a very singing manner. So I think that these two movements really illustrate beautifully where C.P.E. Bach was going in terms of his own exploration of pre-romantic, perhaps proto-romantic writings on the piano. Enjoy. finally, I want us to listen to three of the canons from Bach's The Musical Offering. The first is the crab canon, where you will hear the theme and then an extension of that theme in moving eighth notes, and that will be moving forward while exactly the same music is happening, but backwards. And so it's the same music going forwards and backwards simultaneously. They cross and they end together. Absolutely brilliant writing. So we have the crab canon. Enjoy. Next, we have the perpetual, the endless canon on a royal theme. I believe we cycle through this canon 4 times, and it's literally written to potentially be played without end. I think from a cosmological standpoint, there's a lot of significance there. Again, I'm joined by Caroline Pittman, flute, and Veronica Kolegas, cello. Then finally, we're going to hear a much more extended, by far the longest of the 10 canons from the musical offering. We have the canon at the fifth, and I'm joined again by my friend and colleague Caroline Pittman, flute, and this is the canon at the fifth. Enjoy. So I hope you found some of this information and the musical examples to be of interest. Thank you so much for sticking with and watching this video. Thank you for your support. Let me know what you're interested in, and I will be more than happy to do a little musical exploration for you and create some video content based on your interest. So thank you so much, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.